This is my newest camera. It's quite small, but don't let that fool you. It's also rubbish. Familiarity tends to grow interest, and for each of our kids shortly after their second birthday, they became interested in holding and using the cameras for which they had grown accustomed to posing. Camera reviews aren't anything new, but they tend to be focused towards adults looking for complex features in shiny new cameras. A case in point, the Olympus OMD EM1X, my previous purchase. But that's a different video. Now this was enough to pique my youngest's interest, but it's quite difficult for a 2-year-old to try and hold this, let alone pick it up and use it without dropping it. A 2-year-old trying to pick up and use this verges on the comical. There aren't many reviews targeting cameras for little kids. There's a few, and they often tend to cover similar cameras that have similar specs. Those cameras tend to be colorful, durable, but light, often with big buttons, which is useful for kids that are still learning their fine motor control. They're also expensive for what you get. The Hamilton Buell is one example where for $60 you get a 1.3 megapixel camera. That's still better than the options that were available when we were looking for cameras for my oldest child a couple years ago, where the Fisher-Price kids camera was the best option, and that came with a 0.3 megapixel or VGA size sensor, 640 by 480. That's basically the same resolution that your early 90s computer probably used. This Nokia flip phone has a 3.2 megapixel camera built into it, even though it's not very good at low light. The 1.3 megapixel cameras you're getting in these kids cameras aren't going to be better for sure. That's why we ended up looking elsewhere for cameras for my daughter. Nowadays you can get a 10 megapixel camera for $10 in reasonable condition, or you can get a excellent condition 16 megapixel camera like this Nikon for about $25. We got a Canon A1200 and a Canon SD780IS for her, both used. They're about 6 or 7 years old at the time, and we paid about $40 each for them. The S780IS even has image stabilization, which is great for young children that have trouble keeping the camera still as they take a photo. The other thing that I liked about both cameras was that they had an optical viewfinder. The cameras aren't particularly durable, they weren't meant for children, but when you can find them for about $10, assuming your kids aren't going to just throw them around, it's reasonable to get them. These all make great beginning cameras for a 5-year-old. These digital point and shoots are often loaded with a lot of features. They're aimed at spec sheets for adults. So to go with something a little bit more simple, you might want to go a little bit further back and actually look at film cameras. One option that does actually show up quite a bit in reviews for kids is the Fuji Instax series, the Fuji Instax Minis. That's actually the camera that we ended up going with for my daughter. For her, we got the Instax Mini 8, which is a couple years old now. We bought it towards the end of its life, frankly, because it was cheaper than the Instax 9 that was coming out to replace it. And the Instax 9 really didn't add anything that seemed to add benefit. It provided a selfie mirror, things that didn't seem necessary to encourage a 2-year-old to play with. For Christmas this year, though, since the Instax 8 was out of sale, we ended up going with the Instax 9. It's also, again, not the newest version, but because of that, you can end up finding it for a good price if you can find a place that still has it in stock. Fuji's going to keep selling it until they run out of stock, and then you're going to be stuck buying the Instax 10 or 11 or one of the other models of Instax. They each have a fixed focus lens. It's got a fixed shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, which, given the ergonomics of this camera, is usually good enough for even a young child to get a sharp photo. My daughter loves the Instax cameras with its immediate feedback and something tangible that they can hold. We've collected a number of the photos that she's taken and stored them in a binder that she can use to show guests, show family when they come by. Although mostly she's just interested in what pops out and that she can look at it for the time being. The Instax camera is super simple. A parent can load the film, and beyond that, the only thing that you really have to worry about is setting the right exposure, and the only variable that you can control with this camera is the aperture. You can try teaching your child to line up what the camera thinks is the right exposure with an LED with the aperture ring on the camera. Simply line up the dot on the lens with the LED, or you can set it for your child and let it go. The newer cameras take care of the exposure for you. Even the 9 that we're getting our boys is now obsolete, but Fuji is continuing to sell them while they have stock. They're being replaced by the Instax 11, which has automatic exposure, so you don't have to worry about setting that. But it also comes with a variable shutter, which, while providing a little bit more flexibility and creative control, I think actually makes it a less good learning camera, because the shutter can suddenly start getting slower than the 1/60th of a second. And that's when you start getting shaky pictures and less sharp images. And that, I've seen, is the biggest issue that young kids have with sharp pictures, is that shutter speed getting too slow. My suggestion is try and find an Instax 9 before they go out of stock, if you're looking at getting one of those for a young kid. Each pack of film has 10 shots, and that was a good way of introducing and reinforcing counting and subtraction with my daughter when she was younger. She could add up the shots that she took and subtract those from 10 and practice her arithmetic. The Instax wasn't the first camera that my daughter used, though. That would be the Leica X2. And if you don't mind spending $800 on a toddler's camera, why is it good? It lets you set a fixed shutter speed. As I said with the Instax, having a fixed shutter speed that's fast enough to avoid camera shake is probably the most important thing in a young child getting sharp pictures. Like the Instax, the Leica obviously does not have a fixed focus lens. It's got autofocus. You can either program it for zone focusing if you think that will work for your kid, or what we usually did is just set it to single point autofocus right in the middle of the camera. Now, in addition to Leica, there's a few other cameras that are fixed lens, non-zoom cameras that let you set the shutter speed like this. Specifically, the Fujis come to mind. Unfortunately, it's been hard to find those used, so you can't really save a lot of money with those. And even right now, I'm having trouble finding this one used. There were quite a few of them earlier in the year available for about $700, but right now I'm seeing them for $1,500, which is a lot more than I would pay for this camera. So we found this one on Prime Day. It had an advertised 5-megapixel camera. From the screenshot, it looked like it had a viewfinder, although that turned out to be just printed on. And that 5-megapixel sensor turned out to just be a 640 by 480 or 0.3 megapixel sensor that had an option to interpolate or effectively waste more space to store a 5-megapixel image. Quality is no better than if you took that 0.3 megapixel image and just used a basic interpolation algorithm to increase the size of the file. It's really ugly and not any more usable. Not only that, but the camera is no simpler to use than the point and shoots. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's even more confusing. The camera supports 3 modes. One is still shots, one is video shots, 1080p apparently, and then the final is replay. And if you're hoping to avoid complexity, you are not going to get it from this camera. Is if you hand it to a kid, what they're going to do is start playing with modes, and you're going to have no idea what it's doing, whether you're taking a picture, a video, or in playback mode. The camera also comes with a built-in game, although it may not live up to the expectations set from your 90s era cell phone. Like older point and shoots, it also has frustrating shutter lag. So the kid goes to take a picture, hits the button, and starts moving the camera away. And as the kid's moving the camera away is when it finally takes the picture. The one benefit of this camera, if there is any, is that it does let you set a burst of pictures to be taken. So you take a 3-shot burst. And that, I found, gives a slightly better chance at capturing a usable picture. Either the kid's holding it still for the first shot or the middle shot, usually not the last shot, but it does give a slightly better hit rate, I found. All 3 of my kids' first reaction is to try and mimic using a viewfinder, and for my daughter, it was the natural way that she ended up using them. Whether it was on the X2 that she started with or the Instax camera that is hers, using the viewfinder seems to be the most natural for her, although she's also started getting used to using the LCD screens for the cameras that have them. If you're looking for a camera for your kids, My advice is obviously you know your kids better than I do or anybody that's designing cameras. Choose a camera based on what you think will be best for them. For older kids, I strongly encourage you to look at used point and shoots. They're going to be the best value. They're going to be cheap, but with much higher quality. You can find one with image stabilization. Even for younger kids, they'll often have a sports mode or a pets mode or a kids mode, which, while intended to capture kids running around quickly, is also a way of tricking the camera to have a short shutter speed, a very quick shutter speed, so that there's less chance of shake in the kid's hands if the kid's the one taking the pictures. For a young child, I recommend the Instax Mini. Getting into photography, having something tangible for them to look at is really exciting. This $20 toy camera, it takes really bad pictures and is really frustrating to use. I can't recommend it at all. The only benefit it has over this equivalently priced Nikon or this cheaper Canon camera is that it is probably a little bit more durable when it's thrown. It's shiny and pink. If your kid just wants to pick up a toy camera, run around and play with it, maybe this is a better option. On the other hand, if all you're doing is looking for a toy, this works just as well in my experience. As my kids run around pretending to take pictures with their camera phone, much cheaper, even more durable. I would go with that. Anything else, use point and shoot or Instax film camera, definitely the ways to go.